All right, folks, well, this time around, we're going to take another look at HDR inside of Photoshop, okay? We've seen it before in Photomatix, but we're going to look at HDR inside of Photoshop CS5. Before we do that, I want to take a quick minute here just to kind of show you some photos in HDR where HDR becomes applicable, because that's just as important, figuring out what to shoot in HDR and then actually making the photo. Realistic scenes, I'm shooting into the sun. There's no way I would have gotten detail in the rocks here in the foreground without bracketing in the camera, okay? Let's take night scenes. Anything in night is a great candidate for HDR, because these lights get so bright that they get really hard to see, because we need a longer exposure. Here's another example. We need a longer exposure, and if we don't have the short exposures to tone some of these lights down, what happens is we get the longer exposure to get the detail in all the areas that are dark, but then what happens is we get these just big bright areas over here. They're just basically all blown out instead of little tiny lights that are blown out. You're going to see an even bigger area with lots of flare that's blown out. So that's another example here. Let's take a look through. Here's one. Same thing. It's a big blown out white area because it is a light, but without HDR, what happens is it's even bigger than that, and there's a lot of flare, and it's very difficult to see. Let's take a look here. Here's another example. Texture, architecture, details, things like that. They work really, really well for HDR. Lights, okay? Anything with lights and details works great for HDR. You can see here, same thing. I know the light is white, it's blown out, but without HDR, you would have just had this big white blob over here, and it'd be so distracting that it'd be hard to kind of get over. And then I guess our architecture, texture, details, things like that, they work great. Grungy scenes, things that have a surreal type of a look to them work really well. A couple other things here. So this is a little bit, still HDR, a little bit toned down, but lots of depth, lots of texture. You can see here lots of depth and texture and dimension back there. That's what HDR is really good at. Another one, churches, indoors. I think that works great. Museums, places like that, and then of course night photos, especially this one. It was raining. It really brings out that texture in some really nice ways for this. Okay, lots of details, lots of texture. So you've got to pick what works for an HDR. Cityscapes. Again, anything at night works, is a really good candidate. So let's take a look here. We're going to jump over to Bridge. What I do is I put my camera on a tripod, and I set it to auto exposure bracketing. Most of your DSLRs have that. Just look up the feature, auto exposure bracketing. And what you're going to do is we want basically 3 exposures. We want our metered exposure, which is basically you point your camera and shoot, and then auto exposure bracketing will take it. We want to go -2 stops, and then we want to go +2 stops. And that gives us a good range to work with when it comes to HDR. Once we have those 3 photos, we're going to go into Photoshop. Now, Photoshop didn't used to be, how do I put this nicely? Photoshop's HDR wasn't very good, all right? When CS5 came out, it became a lot better. So we're going to come on under here to the Tools menu to Photoshop, and we're going to come down here to Merge to HDR Pro. And it takes about a minute or two. I've already had mine kind of running. So it actually merges all 3 photos into one. And what you get left with is a pretty flat representation of your scene. But if you look at it compared to any one of the 3 photos that we were just looking at here, I mean, it's a big difference. There's the really dark one. There's a bright one. And then there's our overexposed one. In none of these do we have all the details put together, right? But when we look at our HDR photo, while it is flat, it's gotten us a pretty good portion of the way there. Now it just comes to the way that you process it, okay? And this is a 2-part video. The first part of this, I'm just going to show you how to process the photo. The second part will show you how to do the post-processing, because that's just as important as what you're going to do here. So the first thing to know about Photoshop is detail rules everything. Until you start to increase the detail setting, these sliders up here, pretty much everything else doesn't really respond very well. So when I increase detail, now when I start to go to strength and I start to go to radius, now I start to see some changes. Radius just says it's going to be adding contrast. Once it finds an area to add contrast, how far out do you want to affect that? And you can see where it almost looks like it's glowing when you start to really increase that radius. And then strength says, well, how much of this effect how much of this contrasty effect do you want me to add? So I'm going to go with a lower radius in this example. And then we're going to increase the strength setting. We can even increase the detail setting, and you'll start to see it change quite a bit here. All right, see the difference? Okay, now we come down here to gamma. Gamma basically, when you crank it up, flattens out the photo. When you crank it down, it makes it really contrasty. So generally, I'm going to bring it up a little bit just to flatten it out. I'm not going to worry too much about it now because there is post-processing to this, but it brings out a lot more detail inside some of those shadowy areas, okay? And then we come down here, exposure, just general overall brightness for the photo. Don't worry about that too much. Pretty much the exposure that it gives you is going to be pretty right on. And then shadow. Do you want to bring out more detail in the shadows, or do you want to hide the detail in the shadows? So moving it to the left makes the shadows darker. Moving it to the right makes them brighter. Same thing with highlights. Moving it to the left tones down the highlights. Moving it to the right makes them brighter. Look at the lamp. To the left, to the right. You can see it's like turning the light on. So I'm going to bring it to the left to tone it down a little bit. And let's come over here to my strength, radius. See if we can bring that in just a little. All right. So once you're at the place of the look that you're going for, and it's very much look based. If you want more realistic, then tone down your detail. Bring your detail down, not so far down, but bring your detail down. If you want to go for more of that grungy style, then bring your detail up. All right, that's the way this all responds to everything. Remember, the detail slider is the key though. All right, so we're going to click OK. Believe me, it's cut off your screen here, but right where my cursor is, right below, is an OK button. So we're just going to click OK. And Photoshop is going to it's going to go through, it's going to process this, and it's going to kind of mash everything together to the point where you've got a regular image to work with. Because right now we're working with 3 images that were kind of put together. All right, so we want to get this into a state where we can actually work with it inside of Photoshop. And that's where we are now. So we've gone from each one of these, none of them really on their own, too much to talk about, right? And we've gone to this, which by itself, and this is where HDR gets a bad name from, by itself is not done yet. It's not ready to stand on its own, but HDR has gotten this bad name because so many people just finish here. Like, oh, I created my HDR, I'm done. No, okay? Now you've got your photo inside of Photoshop. The next part of this is the post-processing, okay? And that's what we're going to cover in the next HDR video that I do, where I'll talk about what you do after the photo. Honestly, folks, it's as important, if not more important, than what we just did when it comes to creating a good HDR photo.